So good evening, everybody here and online. It's a pleasure to have you all join us today for the next talk in the CIS lecture series. We've got two speakers who are currently working at the Woolf Institute who've joined us this evening. First of all, Jamilla Hekmoun, who's a research fellow leading on the Faith in Mental Health project at the Woolf. Did you say you just submitted your PhD? So yeah, so she's not currently writing up her PhD. She had submitted her PhD on Muslim men's mental health, and in that she explored the relationship between faith, ethnicity, masculinity, and mental health. Jamila's got an extensive track record in the realm of mental health. She's a former board trustee at the Muslim Youth Helpline and chair of the Muslim Mental Health Alliance, which is a network of organisations aimed at collaborating on mental health. She's also an executive board member at the Muslim Council of Wales and sits on the Islam UK Centre Management Board at Cardiff University. She's written about mental health and also has won a 2022 Cardiff University 30-ish award, which I had to look up because I didn't know what that was. But I see it is for, you know, exceptional achievement of young people who either are pre-30 or feel pre-30, which makes us all eligible.
Was at the time
She was pre-30 when she received it. So she's joined today by Seherish Abrar, a junior research fellow and social media manager at the Woolf Institute, who's also been involved in the Faith in Mental Health project since its beginning, and also did some of the foundation work to establish that project. And she has recently co-authored a publication in the Journal of Mental Health, Religion and Culture. And we're delighted to welcome them both today to talk to us about Muslim mental health then and now. So I shall hand over to our speakers.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for having us. Apologies, I can't talk very loud. I got ill as soon as I submitted my PhD, which I think is a metaphor for something, I don't know what. But we'll just do a quick introduction to the Woolf. How do I?
Maybe at the computer.
At the computer? Or
Anywhere you want to.
I'm pressing the right button. There we go. So I'm going to hand over to Seherish. She's been there longer than I have.
I have indeed. This is the Woolf Institute. It's on Madingley Road, so it's not very far from here. Do come and visit us. So we are an interfaith charity focusing on relations between the Abrahamic faiths. But more recently, we've been looking at issues affecting a particular religion and how we can help build community around that and awareness around that. So we have MPhil students and PhD students, some of which are part of the faculty here, and we do a lot of events. We had a conference today around milestones and turning points, which some people attended. So yeah, I'm also the social media manager, so always keep a lookout on there because that's where all the events are. Next, please. So I'll just go over what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be a very brief overview of Muslim mental health, kind of the history behind it and things that we're looking at in our Faith in Mental Health project. So we'll start with what is mental health, why it's important we understand what it is and what it's not. Islam and mental health, kind of looking around what's the relationship between the two. Muslim mental health then, kind of looking at the history and scholarship behind that. Muslim mental health now, more contemporary thinking around the subject. And then finally, we'll end on a little bit about the project that we've been working on.
So I wanted to start off by defining mental health, because I think a pet peeve of mine is when I see people saying mental health and what they really mean is mental illness or mental ill health. Because mental health is something that everybody has. It's just like physical health is the thing, and it can be the, you know, positive or negative. And when I've done training before, we've kind of described mental health as being on a spectrum, with positive mental health at one end or good mental health and negative mental health at the other end. And you can go up and down across the spectrum from hour to hour, day to day, month to month. So it's important to understand that mental health and mental illness aren't the same thing and that everybody has mental health. And I think that can kind of contribute sometimes to the stigma around talking about mental health, because I think when people hear mental health, sometimes they think of mental illness. I mean, there shouldn't be stigma about either thing, but I think it's helpful when having these conversations. But I put the World Health Organization definition up there as well. So a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of everyday life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So they're kind of describing more of a positive mental health, a positive state of well-being. So just wanted to cover a little bit about the language around mental health. So wanted to talk about mental health in Islam. So through a lot of our research, what we've found is that when there is a need for Islamic counselling or Muslim mental health, a lot of organisations, a lot of practitioners will turn back to what does Islam say in order for Muslims then to be more comfortable speaking about mental health, in order to have some examples. There is sometimes a barrier which I've seen where some Muslims are reluctant to speak about mental health or seek counselling or therapy because it's seen as something Western or un-Islamic that doesn't have any basis within Islam and Muslim history. So one example that is used quite a lot is the year of sorrow, al-Huzn, I think I've pronounced that correctly, and that was in the 10th year of prophethood experienced by the Prophet Muhammad, which is equivalent to the year 619. So during this time, the Prophet Muhammad's wife and his uncle both passed away, and his wife had been a support to him when he received revelation, and his uncle protected him from persecution in Mecca, also passed away. And losing his uncle meant he lost a main source of support and the person who shielded him from harm. So it's an example that's often used to show that, you know, trials and tribulations happen to what Muslims, or who Muslims consider to be the best of mankind, and he got through them, and this is how he dealt with them, remaining patient, remaining resilient, but also accepting that sadness and that trials and tribulations do face Muslims. I mean, that kind of sounds silly sometimes saying it out loud, but it is something that is an idea that I've seen a lot, particularly, I would say that it's getting better, but the idea definitely about 8 years ago when I first got into Muslim mental health, the idea that Muslims shouldn't be sad because we should always be thankful and grateful for what Allah has given us, and that we should just kind of get on with things, when in fact, you know, there are examples of people in our history going through grief and experiencing trials and tribulations. If I can get this page open. Okay, so we've got a lot of Islamic thinkers from the Islamic Golden Age throughout history. So I'm going to go through a few of them, because again, there's this misconception that psychology and mental health is, you know, a very Western and a very new idea. Whereas really it's something that has been going on for a long periods of time. It's something that has been thought about by great thinkers. It's something that people have been trying to find solutions for. It's things that have existed. So Al-Kindi was from Baghdad, and he was considered as the first Muslim philosopher. He wrote books relating on sleep, dreams, and the eradication of sorrow. At-Tabari is a Persian and Muslim convert, and he was a pioneer in the field of child development, and he emphasized the need for psychotherapy and urged physicians to be smart and witty to make their patients feel better. So he advised sort of relating with your patients. So he would ask his patients whether they ate grapes or watermelon, as sort of to build conversation with his patients to make them feel a bit more relaxed, I suppose. And that's something that we're taught to do now. I mean, in previous roles where I've had speaking with service users, you know, we don't go in and speak about the big issues first and foremost. You know, you don't say, oh, why are you depressed? you know, first of all, for example, you'd start and get to know someone as a person. So these ideas that are becoming really popular now have been throughout Islamic history. So Abu Zayd al-Balkhi is considered one of the first cognitive and medical psychologists who was able to clearly differentiate between neuroses and psychoses, and he classified neurotic disorders. And he showed how rational and spiritual cognitive therapies can be used to treat some of these disorders. Some people believe he started what is now like cognitive behavioral therapy. And I know there's a lecturer in, I want to say Leeds, I always forget which university, Ghazal Amir, she does a lot on Leeds, yeah. She does a lot on cognitive behavioral therapy from an Islamic point of view, and encompasses some of al-Balkhi's ideas. So he classified neuroses into 4 emotional disorders: fear and anxiety, anger and aggression, sadness and depression, and obsessions, and also compared physical with psychological disorders and showed their interaction in causing psychosomatic disorders. Al-Razi promoted psychotherapy. He pointed out that hopeful comments from doctors encouraged patients, made them feel better, and promoted speedier recovery. So again, kind of that bedside manner thing that's more talked about now. Ibn Sina, he wrote about the mind, its existence, the mind-body relationship, sensation, perception, and he wrote a book called Ash-Shifa, which is healing. And lastly, Al-Ghazali, so he spoke a lot about the self and wrote a lot about the self, and he described the self by 4 terms. So qalb, which is the heart; ruh, which is the soul; nafs, which is the self; and aql, which is the mind or the brain. So he kind of took to mean that all of those kind of encompass your spiritual, emotional identity. Okay, so, sorry. Okay, thank you. So a bit more towards the now, I suppose. So at the moment, what the kind of Muslim mental health, Islamic psychology landscape looks like. We've got Islamic psychology. So these are people like, if anyone's heard of Abdullah Rothman, he used to be at CMC, Cambridge Muslim College. He's one of the, I was going to say one of the dons of Islamic psychology, but that doesn't seem the appropriate word, but he's very well known, well respected within Islamic psychology, reintroducing holistic wellness from Islamic perspective. So encompassing things like what Ghazali said about the ruh and nafs, that would kind of come under Islamic psychology. Then you've got Islamic counselling, so that might be where you go and see a counsellor who may or may not be Muslim, and they talk to you about stories from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from the Hadith that might help you in your faith be able to overcome any mental health conditions. And then Muslim mental health organisations, so these are kind of perhaps maybe the first organisation someone might be in contact with if they have any struggles with their mental health. So for example, Muslim Youth Helpline, Inspirited Minds, lots of these organisations, and we've got a slide at the end that do offer these services. I think from the last 8 years where I've seen the shift mostly around Muslim mental health is 8 years ago, it was very much around stigma, taboo, those were the conversations, you know, that within Muslim communities, no one wants to talk about their mental health. There's a stigma around mental health. And while that still exists, like it does in every community, now there are more conversations around how support can now be better, what's the word? Can be more appropriate, more catered to cultural and religious backgrounds for Muslims especially. This is a big thing, and that's kind of the way things are going in terms of Muslim mental health now. And over to Seherish.
Thank you. Just to point out on the previous two slides, we do have some references and further reading if you're interested. Particularly on the slide of the early scholars, there's a lot of good overviews there if you're interested in that. It's a really good starting place. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about Muslim mental health, and I'd like to make a little bit of a distinction between Islamic psychology and Muslim mental health. Which has come directly actually from Islamic psychologists themselves after interviewing them. So Islamic psychology is more about rethinking about humans and what makes up a human, and kind of using that in your practice. Whereas Muslim mental health, you can think of it more around awareness and kind of integrating so-called Western or mainstream services to be more suitable and more appropriate for Muslim audiences. So that's what we're looking at the Woolf Institute currently. So these are some resources. This is a report from the Muslim Youth Helpline, which Jamilla actually did the research for and wrote up. So it's been very helpful for us. And on the other side, we have a fact sheet that we actually made in collaboration with the Centre for Mental Health in London, who unfortunately they couldn't join us today. It is available on our website, so you'll be able to read it properly. And now that we've given you quite a brief introduction and overview of what mental health is within Islam and what Islamic psychology is, and we'll look at some of the issues Muslim communities face when they need to actually access mental health care, specifically in the UK. So as with any social issue, Muslims are largely disadvantaged, as we know, there's a lot of talk, as Jamilla said, around stigma and taboo, and this has even come into the mainstream with, you know, Muslims kind of being branded as a hard to reach audience. And we can see here that we have a number of people. So how many people spoke to nobody? 40% of people spoke to nobody when they felt they had a mental health issue or struggle. And we can see that a lot of people have, where has it gone? 52% have suffered depression, 63% have suffered anxiety, 32% have suffered suicidal thoughts. And a lot of those people didn't talk to anyone. So we really want to understand why. And yes, there are people in the community and there is still stigma within the community, and you know, we can talk for days about that because there's a lot of research on that. But actually what we want to talk about are the external factors that might be affecting Muslims' willingness to go to mainstream services or to even speak about mental health. So we really can't see it on the fact sheet, but there are a number of detriments that kind of put Muslims at a disadvantage at the beginning of, you know, a mental health journey. So things like income inequality and poverty, poorer education outcomes, lower levels of employment, and all of these things in general for anyone are risk factors for poorer mental health. And the fact that Muslims are greatly kind of, you know, experience these really makes us wonder what the difference is. If a lot of people are experiencing these, how come some people are going to get help and some people are not? And that's why we looked at access and experience and outcomes. So what we found was that a lot of people don't know where to go to get help, or that they've gone to get help and it's not actually been helpful for them because things, cultural and religious things that they find important to them and that are important to them are not actually acknowledged and are kind of seen as a hindrance. So we often hear that Muslims are hard to reach community, and because of that, so basically that means the NHS or the government has made a service that they think targets Muslims specifically, but they're not getting the engagement that they thought they would. And because of that, in conclusion, Muslims are hard to reach, we've done our job kind of thing. And really what we're arguing kind of through this project is that maybe they haven't been accessed in the right way or they haven't been targeted in the right way. So for example, a very common and arguably easy solution would be to have things in community languages. There are a lot of migrants to the UK, a lot of refugees, and if things are not available in a language that they understand, they're not going to be able to access it. But we can also go a step further, and as Jamilla said, looking at taboo and stigma, there's a lot of taboo around mental illness and arguably mental health. So what a lot of people, and specifically the Muslim organisations that we talked about before, are doing is really focusing on well-being, because well-being sounds positive. So if you talk to someone about their well-being, it's more kind of, how are you doing, how are things, rather than, you know, you're not giving them a diagnosis, which is kind of like a label for them to be stigmatized with. Move to the next one. Yes. So I'll talk a little bit about the Faith and Mental Health Project. So the aims of the project are to bridge Muslim communities and mental health services, encourage religious and mental health literacy, and to do this through identifying and amplifying best practice of collaborative approaches. So what we've been doing is looking at case studies of best practice where a mainstream organisation such as the NHS or a well-known charity like Mind and a Muslim-facing organisation, usually at the grassroots level, have worked together to offer a better service. And I'll give you one example in Peterborough, actually, because it's not too far away. So there's a local Mind charity there, and they run a perinatal service for women. So that's from conception right up until, I think, 2 or 3 years postnatal. Around 5 ways to well-being to help people with postnatal depression, any kind of struggle they may have during that period. And they actually realized after looking at census data that they were not engaging with the local Muslim community, which is quite sizable in Peterborough. So what they did is they partnered with a local organization, which was well known, the community knew them, they had a good standing, to kind of think about why that was happening and how they can better their service to include these people and be useful to that particular demographic. And they hired peer researchers, so they hired women from the community who were mothers and had been through these struggles to kind of go and talk to their friends, talk to people in the mosque and find out what they need, how they're feeling, why they might not be coming to this service. And a lot of it for Muslims is very common knowledge. So things around, I don't really relate to what this person was saying or to what a non-Muslim woman was experiencing. But more specific things around how the workshops themselves were delivered. So one of the things they did was music therapy. So for some Muslims who don't listen to music or they don't agree with listening to music, that was a barrier. So they were not comfortable going to that setting and receiving that help. So one of our big recommendations that will come in our report next month, hopefully, stay tuned, is the need for collaborative approaches, but not collaboration in the sense that what we've seen in the past is kind of a larger organization or mainstream organization going to a community and saying, you need us, therefore we are collaborating with you. But actually what we found that really works and what we've seen work in Peterborough is a real exchange of knowledge. So there has to be some kind of benefit for the smaller organization, the Muslim organization as well, in that they are, they get more marketing or they learn about grant processes and funding bids and things like that. Did I miss anything?
Nope. Nope.
So that's pretty much what we're doing with Faith and Mental Health. We have just published an article, myself and Dr. Julian Hargreaves, which basically summarizes everything we talked about today, as well as a pilot study that we did last year for the project. And as I said, hopefully, inshallah, next month, our report will be coming out and we'll be able to have a lot more talks like this with some recommendations. Thank you.
Just before we finish, as we spoke about mental health, I thought it was important to include where to go for support. If you are struggling with your mental health, see your GP. If you yourself or someone who is in immediate danger to themselves or others, call 999. The Samaritans number is there, 116123. I think that's etched in my brain. And specialist Muslim organisations, Muslim Youth Helpline, they'll answer calls from anyone. They're open from 4 p.m. till 10 p.m. every day. Mindworks UK offers free counselling, and Muslim Counsellors and Psychotherapists Network. You can find a Muslim counsellor or psychotherapist, as the name suggests. I'll just leave it there in case anyone wants to take a picture or anyone on Zoom wants to screenshot. And here's, I don't know why there's a giant K in the middle of it.
I think it's my UK.
Oh, yes, it's the UK from Seherish's email address. But if anyone wants to contact us, please do. And that's the link to our project. And we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure you've opened up lots of avenues of which we could follow in terms of questions. Neil, I know we've got quite a large online audience. Do you mind just flagging if there's a lot of questions coming up online? Otherwise, we'll start with questions from the room.
Okay, we're still not happening because it is something that keeps coming up within the Muslim community, and I don't think there's enough information, even academically available, about the types of organizations and that kind of thing. And that's where my question comes in. You listed a few Muslim organizations, and probably because of my own kind of personal research interests, I'm interested in these organizations. If you can tell us a little bit more about when they were founded, who are the type of people who came together to put these initiatives in place. I'd love to hear more even about the challenges that they face, because there's a distinction in your presentation between, like Muslim kind of empowered or Muslim motivated initiatives and mainstream initiatives. But I imagine that even within, Muslim offerings of mental health care, there can be tensions and issues and challenges that may come up when you're trying to reach the community. So I don't know if that might be too many questions, but
I'll try and remember all of them. So in terms of the Muslim mental health organizations themselves, a lot of them are a lot older than I think people would think. So, for example, Muslim Youth Helpline was set up in 2001, and it was actually set up by a guy in his bedroom. And he noticed that a lot of Muslims were struggling with their mental health. It wasn't something that was spoken about. I think initially he noticed it especially around young people in exams and things like that. So he set that up, and then Muslim Counselors Psychotherapists Network, Myra, set that up about 12 years ago. So a lot of these organizations are quite established. Inspirited Minds, which is another one that's been going about 9 or 10 years. So they have been there quite a while, and I think a lot of them were set up to fill that gap that mainstream organizations weren't meeting. And I think there is sometimes a higher level of trust with these organizations compared to the more mainstream ones, because they were set up by Muslims. I think there is a lot, people have more confidence sometimes in going to see a counsellor or an organisation that they know will understand them, that look like them, that have similar backgrounds to them. I think a common thing that I've heard of it with Muslims seeing secular or non-Muslim counsellors is that you're constantly having to give your counsellor or therapist an RE lesson, and you're there for therapy or counselling. You shouldn't have to explain what Ramadan is, or you shouldn't have to explain why something is important to you. I heard a story a while back of a woman going to see a counsellor, a Muslim woman, and she wore the hijab, and she was explaining that she had struggles with it, and the counsellor just said, well, we'll just take it off then. And it's that not quite understanding why something like that is important to a Muslim, why particular rituals or particular things are important. I think that is something that that's why the need for Muslim-run organisations is there. There was probably a second part of your question that I've forgotten.
I'm just also wondering about the challenges that might come up in these types of organizations, because, essentially, it's easy to say, okay, there's more trust, and you don't have to explain hijab, but I imagine there's also other challenges that can come up.
There's challenges both inside and outside. I suppose from the outside, it's quite candidly, it's funding is always an issue, because I think a lot of funding bodies are very reluctant to fund organisations that have a religious element to them or that cater to a particular religious group. So you kind of have to either not accept the funding or kind of skirt your way around it and say, all of those organisations will be open to everyone. But I think there is sometimes Muslim organisations can find it harder to get funding. I don't know if that's to do with prejudice. I don't know if that's Islamophobia, but it's something that I've come across and noticed. Internally, I think there is still sometimes, the misunderstanding, the stigma, the taboos. I think it's something that's generational. I think my generation, so I'm 30, I think that around my age and younger, there is more of an understanding and acceptance of mental health. If I try to explain to my dad what mental health is, which actually he was asking me about yesterday for some reason, he was saying how it's linked to drugs and only people who take drugs are on, have mental health issues. And it's that kind of generational thing where I think that's an issue for Muslim organizations. And because there are mental health issues in older generations in the Muslim community, but they are harder to reach, harder to find the language in which to talk about it, if that makes sense.
There's one online and then there we go.
Question from Ahmed Kurdi saying, after realising the challenge faced by Mind at Peterborough, what was your recommendation or recommendations?
We didn't really need to give them any recommendations because they went out and did it themselves. So they realized they weren't getting the engagement that they wanted. So basically what they did was looked at the census for Peterborough. They looked at the percentage of the Muslim population in Peterborough and then were thinking, well, this doesn't reflect the percentage of Muslims that we've had. In, I think, 7 years of the service, they had like 4 Muslim women come and use the service. So, that particular Mind organization themselves are very reflective and, they do a lot of this reflexive work. And they have become this kind of like pioneering group within the Mind organization for co-design of service. So they did it on their own accord. That's why we found them. So that's why they're a good example to use in our case studies. So they found this local organization, which had a few people know about. It had been quite well established in Peterborough for a few years, looking particularly at mental health for Muslim communities, and actually, approached them and wanted to collaborate with them. So actually there is a lot of interest and initiative being taken from both sides. It's just not at the kind of NHS level, which obviously you have to go through all the policy and the dogma of policy and, being a government funded institution for that. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is if whether in your research, whether in classical authors or contemporary authors around Islamic psychology, you find anybody talking about preservation of aql as one of the maqasid al-sharia that applying that framework onto these kind of issues. And the second question is more related about the field in general. I work on Islamic environment, Muslim environment, and many of the dynamics look similar in many ways. One of the dynamics that is present in my field is that often there is, number one, little engagement with the ulama, with the scholars. And number 2, perhaps also a result of that, there is over accumulation of normative claims that often are kind of a retrofit of Islamic concepts or verses of the Quran. And they're just given as they explain themselves essentially with little hermeneutic or little scholarly competency. I wonder whether that's a similar dynamic that you observed, and what, if so, what that might tell us in terms of this field. In terms of environment, it is about very much about Western environmental organizations trying to promote their own agenda to other audiences and kind of cosmetically put in some addendum. And there are obviously areas of overlap, but also areas of distinction. So I wonder whether you notice similar things and what this might tell us.
In answer to your first one, I will have to go back and look at some references. I have no idea off the top of my head. In your second question, so you're talking about, if I understood correctly, that within environmentalism that you study, there's kind of people that will talk about the environment and then just shove in some quotes to kind of be more, what's the word, inclusive. And is that correct? That yes, that definitely happens. I think especially with secular organization, it's all quite performative. You see it a lot with like inclusion and equality and diversity. It's like, oh yeah, let's have a Muslim on our board, or let's have a Black person on our board, and yay, we're so inclusive, we're so diverse. And it's that performativeness. But then, you know, thinking about an instance where I had somewhere I used to work where they said they were inclusive, they got me to write a blog about Ramadan, but then I asked to work from home during Ramadan because this is when Ramadan was like in June and it was horrible commuting into London. And they were like, oh no, you can't do that. And it's like, well, you've said you want to be inclusive and performative on the face of things, but when it actually comes down to it, you're not. And we see that kind of same thing with mental health. I think it's because the easy option is to just, you know, put a verse in here, put a verse in there, get some Muslims on their board or get a Muslim to join their organization. But actual real change takes work and actually takes a lot of being reflexive and thinking about what they've done wrong or not so well. And I think a lot of organizations don't perhaps want to acknowledge that or admit that. Does that answer your question? Also, my friend just finished her PhD in Islam and environmentalism. I'll give you her name at the end.
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting presentation. And I just was wondering about ideas of health and sort of mental health and whether you come across sort of different understandings of what health is actually. I'm just thinking back to your WHO sort of slide at the beginning, which I guess in a way is quite sort of open and I'm not sure it's universal, but the idea that you know, that the aim of the procedure of healing is to be able to sort of cope with challenges and sort of manage one's environment. But are there also understandings of health which go beyond that and think about, you know, perhaps ethical or religious understandings of well-being? Thinking about giving thanks, for example, thank you. You know, is there a sort of aim of for some counsellors of reaching particular kind of ethical state rather than simply getting to a sort of equilibrium where one can cope?
Yeah.
Is that a sort of a secular understanding of health and sort of a limiting one? Or?
Yeah, I think a lot of Islamic or Muslim counsellors have a more holistic approach. So they also look at your spiritual well-being, your mental, physical well-being. So I think there has been a push towards encompassing all of that. And I've particularly noticed that with organizations who are training imams, particularly in mental health, they kind of want to acknowledge spiritual well-being and spiritual health. In terms of definitions, yeah, the WHO one is an interesting one, and I think perhaps it's almost it's like a blanket approach where it's very, what is the word? I've got no words today. I use them all on my thesis. It's very bland almost. I think it's just it doesn't provide enough nuance. I think it's a good starting point, but doesn't go far enough. And I think that's where I like, so I did mental health first aid instructor training, and there they talked about mental health on a spectrum and going kind of up and down that, and more kind of normalizing the, okay, it's okay to be in a position of negative mental health, and it's okay to be in a positive, and, you know, kind of normalizing the ups and downs where I don't think the WHO one quite does that. That makes sense.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
If we look back at the Islamic definitions, there's a bunch of them, but if we go back to the early scholars, so like we talked about what makes up a human is a component of, you know, the aql, nafs, ruh, and jism.
Qalb.
There we go. And most of the scholars agree that in order to be healthy physically, you have to be healthy spiritually as well. So all of those components should be harmonious. So in Islam, really, there's not a distinction between health for your body and health for your mind or your mental health. So it kind of is all kind of encompassed together. So that's why we're looking more towards, you know, we're seeing a lot more holistic approaches generally in general mental health anyway. So, you know, we have like mindfulness now, which is originally a Buddhist idea. So we do think that you know, we could bring these concepts in a little bit more for Muslims.
Online?
Yeah, we have a couple of online questions. A brief one, which is another question asking when Jamilla's PhD will be available to me.
Right, is that someone that I know? Because that sounds like someone trolling me. Is that my mum?
Ahmad Kurdi.
No, I don't know you, sorry. I don't know. Please just pray for my Viva. I don't know when that's going to be, but pray for that. But thank you. I'll send it to you when it is.
The other question is from Lydia Ellis. Is there a role to be played by people educated in Islamic studies who are not necessarily practicing Muslims, as many people there are, in this situation? So when you refer to people's frustrations, having to explain why it's not easy to take off the hijab when having difficulties, can it be helpful sometimes to ask the patient to explain the problem in their own words, to help them to understand the problem and come to their own solution during a CBT session, for example? Because I just sort of refer and says, perhaps it's appropriate sometimes to ask, you know, why it's difficult to decide what to do without it sounding like a frustrating RE lesson.
Yes, I think it's that fine line, isn't it, between asking someone and trying to get their opinion and their thoughts on it, and without them having to kind of over explain themselves. And I think with that, even though I'm not a counsellor, what I've always heard or been taught is just have it led by the person that you are speaking to, with what they are saying, kind of lead off of that and feed off of that. I think there's definitely place for people who do have a background in Islamic studies and who understand Islam and come from a background which isn't filled with Islamophobia, to understand people, to help people through what they're going through. I think I'm rambling right now. Seherish, anything to add while I collect my thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with what Jamilla said. There is definitely a place for people who are informed and knowledgeable about Muslims and Muslim beliefs and Islam more generally. I think one of the easiest ways of doing that is just advocating for religious literacy training, because a lot of the people we talked to, although we did talk to people within NHS settings who are doing things like this, it's not standardized, and that's just basically because a lot of people are scared to approach the topic of religion, specifically around Muslims, because they don't want to be Islamophobic or insensitive. So there is just this kind of thing of let's just not talk about it at all so that it's safe, just like as a safe option. So one of the best things people can do is just talk about needing religious literacy and kind of upskilling and learning more about it to other colleagues who might not know as much.
Yes, and there was an online course that Cardiff University did a couple of years, last year, the year before, where it's about Muslim mental health for practitioners and people who might come across Muslim mental health, like social workers, teachers. So I think that's a really good kind of baseline to start with. And like Seherish said, in a lot of kind of NHS counselling spaces, there is that reluctancy with practitioners to speak about religion and spirituality, because there is no guidance, there is no guidelines, and I think people are afraid of getting it wrong as well. So courses like the one at Cardiff University are really important, because I think if someone is religious, that does play a big part in, you know, even if they are not like praying 5 times a day, or what someone might think of as traditionally Muslim, that still might be a really big part of their identity. It might be a part of their culture. And so that should be understood.
Did you have any more online questions?
Not online, I had a question myself.
Well, why did you ask your question and then we can...
It was hopefully quick. The National Health Service is focused very much on CBT. In your research, have you come across other types of therapy which you feel might be better suited to a specifically Islamic or a specifically religious general audience?
I can't say that any one type is suited for any one kind of group, because I think it's just so individual. It's not a one size fits all thing. And I'm probably going to start a little bit of a rant now, but it's something that I see on social media quite a lot. And while I think it's great that people are really open and talking about their mental health because it helps reduce stigma, there's so much misinformation and people are saying, oh, I have anxiety, so if you have it, you should do X, Y, Z. Whereas it really isn't a one size fits all for everyone. You know, I've had friends that have had great success in therapy. I've had friends that hated it and preferred medication. You know, it's really, it needs to be driven by the individual rather than kind of a blanket approach. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in your room? In which case I'll leap in and take my opportunity. Since I was really interested in what you were saying, and I was really wondering though, how you think sort of classical Islamic sources can be used most effectively, because they were sort of talking about the retrofit, which people might use, but I mean, one can do that from within a community as well as outside a community, sort of cherry pick useful things and sort of refer to and sort of reinterpret something that a medieval philosopher thought, and he would probably not understand the modern definition of what he was doing, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it and make use of that source. So I was really interested in what you thought was the most balanced and positive way to interact with a tradition and make it work in the present.
For those traditions, I would say they would have the biggest impact if more Muslims or imams not knew about them, but spoke about them, because I think people want to know that those things are part of Muslim history, because it kind of almost legitimizes talking about mental health and that kind of holistic approach to mental health. I think those classical, like I've never heard any man talk about any of those scholars, for example, and I think that would be really helpful, because part of an imam's role is a counsellor. They do get people coming to them for all sorts of problems. So as much as there is a need for practitioners to be trained in religious literacy, there is a need for imams and religious leaders to be trained in mental health. And that's not just, you know, current definitions of anxiety and depression and so on, but also examples from Islamic history. That makes sense?
Yeah, that does
think
make
so.
sense. And I was just as a follow-up, I was just wondering what you think the other people what the role of the spiritual is, because it seems to me that I'm not really thinking specifically about Muslim counselling, but faith counselling more generally can often take very different directions to secular counselling, including sort of drawing on what are perceived as external forces, the divine, or however you may. Whereas we're in a secular setting, that would be much more seen in terms of sort of digging deep within oneself. And I wonder what your thoughts on that are, you know, the differences between sort of faith-based counselling and other kinds of counselling.
I think there is a reluctancy amongst NHS counsellors to talk about faith and spirituality. But in terms of kind of the spiritual, it's within the Muslim community, it can be quite difficult, because there has been a tendency in some communities to attribute mental health conditions to jinn and being possessed by jinn, which then you've kind of got that overlap of religion and mental health, where there has been a lot of exploitation by people that say they are therapists and therefore mental health treatment, and then they're performing exorcisms and things like that. So it's a really kind of murky area almost, which is a whole nother topic, jinn and mental health. But yeah, I think definitely within the NHS and more and counsellors more generally, I think there shouldn't be they shouldn't be scared to kind of approach faith and spirituality, and to be educated on that as well. I think even amongst counsellors who perhaps are of the same faith as their client, there's that professional boundary as well. Perhaps they're scared of crossing that. So that's then on organisations like the NHS or the BACP, which is the governing body for counsellors and psychotherapists in the UK, to provide those guidelines, because we are finding that people are wanting faith-based counselling and spiritual counselling to meet their needs.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? Online? In that case, I'd just like to thank you both warmly for your presentation.
Thank
for
you for
answering
having
our
us.
questions. It's really great.
Like with my voice, I sound like